Good morning. My name is Leslie Diaz-Fabros. Me and my group mates will be discussing about the anthropological perspective. I have also here a short story to tell you, and the title is Distance Please. A brilliant Filipinos went to United States as exchange students. They were hosted by a prestigious public university in Illinois. During the orientation, the students were introduced to a huge buffet canteen of the university, and they were supposed to have lunch in that canteen for the duration of their stay in the United States. After their first session in the morning, overexcited to take their first American meal and buffet canteen at the adjacent building, the exchange students rushed into the hall, almost running, and went straight to the food line while clenching on one another and everyone else in the line. Perhaps irritated by the clinging Asians too close to him, an American gentleman turned his back and said firmly to the Filipino students, "Distance, please." In an instant, the Philippine exchange scholars realized that they were in a totally different environment. The normally accepted practices they have in the Philippines may not be necessarily accepted in the other cultures. In this example, too much closeness and almost always clinging to one another as friends are traditionally expected among Asian cultures. However, in the Western practice, where individually is highly emphasized, psychological distance will have to be respected. This section deals with anthropological perspective of understanding the self. Anthropology is generally defined as a study of humankind in all time and places. There are many branches of anthropology. This includes archaeology, primatology, culture anthropology, linguistic trends, in anthropology, especially in understanding the humankind and relation to their culture. So anthropology is the study of all aspects of human condition. This includes human history, the present human condition, and even the future possibilities. It also examines the biology, interactions in the society, language, and especially culture. Anthropology explores the interconnectedness and interdependence of human culture experiences in all places and ages. The kind of broad and holistic perspective of anthropologically inquiry equips the anthropologist the ascendancy in explaining human nature. So how does anthropology explain human nature? What is the anthropological concept of the self? So the self is both biological and cultural entities. The traditional anthropological understanding of the self is that the self is an animal species, which underwent the process of biological evolution and has shared characteristics with other living animals, the hominids in particular. The self is believed to have evolved from apes some 33 million years ago. And in the evolutionary process, the self traced his or her origin from hominids species, Homo sapiens. Since the self has better development in terms of brain with billion neurons and adaptation of the environment for survival, the self develops a culture resulting in behavioral changes. So we have also certain factors of why self is living animal but superior to other animals. Number one is physical aspects. The only animal with a larger brain capability, making him a rational animal. The only animal that can stand straight, allowing him to have better mobility in doing things. And also the social aspects. Self uses languages and symbols in dynamic, complicated, and yet systematic manner, allowing him to communicate and preserve history, knowledge, and culture.
Now, let us examine the two very important concepts in anthropology before we discuss about the self. This concept is culture and enculturation. Culture is traditionally defined as system of human behavior and thought. These cover all customs, tradition, and capabilities of human as they function in society. In other words, culture are those complex structure of knowledge, belief, arts, morals, law, language, traditional practices, and all other aspects needed by human to function in society. Culture is symbolic. When our ancestors learned to use tools and symbols to originate meaning of significant event in life and society, those tools and symbols become an integral part of culture. The burial sites, ancestral home, lands of significant and historical event, the words of Great C. 1973, culture is a historical transmitted pattern of meaning, embodied in communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge and their attitude toward life. The techniques and the social devices and a creative vocation to invent and incorporate new and different expressive operative way. Culture, therefore, is learned and very much integrated in one's costumes and belief. It is ingrained in the pattern and system of one life. Hence, if culture considered all aspects and elements of the self, people must be on guard that culture be adapted or maladaptive. On the other hand, communities shall continue to assess whether the practices, ritual, and customary action continue to manifest the key central values that the individual and community want to demonstrate. On the other hand, communities may also try to read the culture practices that will only extinguish the identity and goodwill of the community. In order to do this, we have to understand the concept of enculturation, broadly defined enculturation. This is transmission of culture from one generated to the next. Unlike biology, hereditary transmission, culture transmission is done through observation, use of language, adaptation to environment, rituals, and formal and informal education. Every member of community will then distinguish themselves from other communities because of the differences in the way people do things in our lives.
Hello everyone, I am the next reporter. The self and person in contemporary anthropology. The anthropological self takes a holistic dimension of the individual person. It considers both the biological and environmental aspects of the person. The genetic component plays a significant role in the cultural development of an individual. Anthropologists even suggest that the genes of the person living in a particular community are already a necessary component for the enculturation of the person. In the same way, environmental exposure is also a vital component in the creation of the cultural self. Some anthropologists claim that environmental exposure starts soon after birth. However, contemporary anthropologists suggest that the environmental exposure starts during the conception. The child inside the mother's womb already hears the language, tastes the food, and feels the mother's emotion. These experiences then are solidified as soon as the child is born. The growing years of the child is very crucial in anthropological perspective. This is the time when the child develops the psychological construct of dependency or interdependency. In many Western cultures where independence is the cultural emphasis, the child is usually provided with a room and is trained to be independent by giving less physical contact from the parents or careers. On the contrary, in most parts of Asia and Africa, children are reared in the close contact with parents, especially the mother, thus developing the sense of dependence on significant others and the immediate community like the family. These rearing practices are the key to develop of the neuromotor functions of the child, and this neuromotor circuitry is the fundamental in the formation of self-awareness. And the next one is self-awareness. Anthropology defines self-awareness as that which permits one to assume responsibility from one's own conduct, to learn how to react to others, and to assume variety of roles. Haviland, 2003. It has been observed that the child starts to conceptualize much earlier by sleeping with parents and exposed to a variety of stimuli like touch and the like. Stimulation is maximized when the child is in the close contact with the mother or carrier and all of the members of the family. This develops the neural circuitry or hand wiring of the brain faster than the children with less stimulation. This is particularly advantageous for us Filipinos because most of the time, our cultural practice is to sleep with our parents until at least school age. Following the faster process of enculturation adds self-awareness is the importance of attachment of positive values to oneself. Child must be able to get the culturally correct values necessary for adult life. Parents, immediate family, and the community play a vital role in the development of child's values. What the child observes from the adults are doing or thinking will more likely to be adopted and imitated by the child. However, in this continued process of self-awareness, the child will eventually develop his or her own identity. This identity is further intensified by a practice common to all cultures, the naming ritual. Naming individualizes a person. It gives a person his or her own unique traits, experiences, personality, and identity status. The latter, however, gives a person's name its place in the group. The person's name is also a symbol of one's status in the community. It either gives you honor or stigma. The person's name is the same time project and process. The self that bears the name continues to establish an identity of the name in the community.
Hello everyone, I am Betsinje Verano. I am the DRIX reporter. Self and behavior environment. In order to straighten the identity to the self, one must be able to grasp the different behavior orientation. There are 4 environment orientation. First, object orientations. The self should be able to act responsively to the cultural objects around. For example, the table. An indigenous group from South Cotabato and they learn to respect the trees, lakes, falls, animals, and also the forest. Next is spatial orientation. The self with personal space and relation to other people or things in earlier example. The individualistic society where independence of utmost importance. Next is temporal orientation. In Filipino philosophy, time is seen as spherical, unlike the Western concept of time as linear, where life events one repeated but may not be able necessarily at the same time. This is also particularly true in the rural communities where only the self or very few people are involved. Last is normative orientation. This proves the self with the grasp of accepted norms in the community where particularly and consider a value being on time is already a gesture. Likewise, the normative orientation is at the same time providing the self an idea of behaviors which are not acceptable by the community.
Hi, my name is Christine Cordova and I'm the next reporter. The self embedded in culture. When the self is able to distinguish what is acceptable behavior and what is not, it only follows that the self is able to recognize difference of oneself and the other. This ability to manage the difference between self is that what makes the self embedded in culture. Psychological anthropologists recognize the thin line that distinguishes the cultural self and the actual self. The latter includes all feelings, thoughts, experience, biological and psychological constitutions, language, and memory. However, the actual self is also being shaped by all the same elements and more. Therefore, while what remains in this distinction is the solid identity of the self in the relation to anything else. The claim of the self as embedded in culture can only be embraced when the self recognizes its relation to everything else. The complexity of cultural identities of people, things, and events shall be recognized and respected by the self. So, in culture, it includes the language, religion, the child, reading methods, our foods, celebration, and etc. So, yung anthropology daw po, nire-recognize niya yung movement of understanding towards plurality and multiplicity of thoughts, belief, convictions, and practices. Hence, this is exactly the contribution of anthropology to the postmodern era. There is now the breakdown of grand narratives, the subdue, the small voices, and the peripheries. In other words, the anthropological movement at this time are already geared towards recognizing the power of culture in influencing little gaps and interstices, meaning intervening spaces between people. So, cultural degradation, or more horrible cultural genocide, means the loss of particular culture due to assimilation or loss of interest. Assimilation happens when a dominant culture, the Ic-Anthropological culture, for example, is overshadowing the inferior culture, meaning the culture possessed by a lesser population living within the Ilocano communities. The inferior culture will eventually lose its identity. As a result, we will not be surprised when children do not know anymore how to speak their indigenous dialect or perform the ritual they were used to perform by the elders. So, yung degradation, ito yung pagka-disrespect or linuluk down kanila. It can cause cultural degradation or due to assimilation or lost interest. Pwedeng sa future, hindi na alam ng mga bata kung paano magsalita ng kanilang dialekto. At pwede rin hindi nila alam kung paano gawin yung mga ritual nila. In larger scale, culture is also lost through continued violence, genocide, inability to respect traditions, religions, belief, and the cultural community's sense of pride, which are largely the result of globalization. For many decades, the Moors of Mindanao, for example, are continuously striving for the recognition of their cultural identity and self-realization. History tells us that both the Moors and the dominant culture living in Mindanao are constantly victimized by the unending violence perpetuated by the various groups. In the end, many of the cultural landmarks, meaning the identity of the people, are either prejudiced or lost forever. So, yung example po ng mga cultural degradation that brought about excessive exposure to media in various forms. Television, for instance, influenced language traditions, belief, knowledge, and even personalities. So, in judging beauties for media purposes, yung mga following criteria na kailangan sundin ay: first, the face must be beautiful and unpimple. Kailangan yung mukha mo daw is maganda tas walang mga pimple. Second is hair must be black and silky. Color must be fair and flawless. The body must be slim and toned, etc. Ayon kay Clifford Geertz in 1973, culture is not a force or a casual agent in the world, but a context in which people live out their lives. Anthropology liberates the self from the fallacies or dominant ideas. In this most liberating science, the self is no longer seen as an entity with innate ideas ready to face the world, and as if the program to respond to the demands of time. Likewise, the self is not seen as the blank state, ready to include all the details of everyday experience, so that it becomes limited only to what is written on that state. So, in anthropology, the self is recognized as first, biological attuned to his or her environment. Second, variably self-aware or mechanism of the elements of culture working within the self. And third, self-reflexive of the uniqueness and differences of the older services, our older self, and everything else around. That's all. Thank you.